Nexus PMG welcomes you to the Bigger Than Us podcast, which we as energy geeks lovingly refer to as the BTU. Bigger Than Us is a podcast that focuses on ideas that will shape the future of our planet and ultimately our existence. We will occasionally lean into energy topics because, after all, it's the key to our collective survival. But we'll also explore other ideas and topics that we believe will have an impact that is bigger than us. And now, on to today's show. Hello, and welcome to the Bigger Than Us podcast. I'm your host, Raj Daniels, and today I'd like to welcome Chante Harris to the show. Chante Harris currently leads the investor network and corporate partnerships for Venture for Climate Tech, a climate tech venture studio and accelerator sourcing the best climate tech solutions across the globe. She also oversees the For Climate Tech Global Innovation Challenge and is spearheading the exploration of a thesis for a new financial mechanism funding early stage climate tech alongside the 2M Capital team. Additionally, she is the co founder of Women of Color Collective in Sustainability, a digital community for women of color to build their careers, create professional success, and advance their well being. Named by America on Tech as an innovator and disruptor in tech policy and Women e News as a pioneering woman in sustainability, Chante is passionate about urban innovation, building sustainable cities, cross sector collaboration, and tapping into community to launch better solutions, initiatives, and technologies. She has worked to scale nationwide campaigns, technologies, and ideas for the Obama administration, Fortune 500 companies, and startups. Chante, how are you doing today?
I'm well, Raj. Thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure to be here. And yeah, my week's getting off to a great start. So excited to dive into this discussion today.
Chante, I'm excited too. And I was going to ask where you're currently located, but I would love if you could just give the audience a brief backstory of where you've been for the past 5 months and where you are right now.
Sure. Yeah. I found myself unexpectedly in Puerto Rico, but majority of the past few months for me have been spent in Mexico, mostly by accident. If anyone who's listening or tuning in to this episode lives in New York City, I think you can resonate with the fact that finding a place to live can be really challenging. And during COVID, I needed to move out of my place pretty quickly and found myself looking at potential apartments and then thinking about how cold it was outside and having to travel and visit places. And had a great conversation with a friend who had been to Mexico City and, just essentially said, why don't you just come to Mexico City? It'll be warm. You can stay in a place that's going to be fairly affordable. And yeah, I ended up there and spent almost 3 months in Mexico and really, really enjoyed it. It was nice to, still be quarantining and safe, but also be in a new place and have some time for exploration.
So, how was life as a digital nomad?
It was great. I mean, I think what's interesting is before COVID, I had thought about how much more I wanted to travel. I love New York, but I also am just an explorer at heart. And so, and I really love diving into culture and new communities. And so, I feel like in some ways, the fact that I still ended up somewhere else during COVID is just reiterated that for me, and I think made it clear that I clearly want to be in different places exploring, people, food, culture, and communities. The last thing I'll say, just because um, I think it really demonstrates my interests. I was so obsessed with Mexico City's built environment and infrastructure, and it just made me think about, how can we build cities in the future that really prioritize people and how they get around, and not just, cars and big buildings. So that's something that I feel like I'm walking away from. I think Mexico City, because it, is a newer city and a lot of, and when you put it into perspective, right? And I think that it was just so lovely to walk around with all of the gardens and the big windows, and everyone has a terrace garden, and it's like we need green, we need green things in cities. Is essentially what I'm coming away with.
I agree. Sounds like a beautiful experience. So, I like to start the show by asking my guests the following question. If you were asked to share something interesting about yourself, what would it be?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I always tell people this is either the first thing I tell you or I like can know you for 2 years and never mention it. So family is really important to me, and my sisters are really important to me. They're all my best friends, and I say that because I'm actually a twin, so I have a twin sister. Her and I do not have the same interest at all. She's currently in medical school, but yeah, I've always felt like I have this best friend who's going through life with me, and then I have two older sisters who are also twins. So my parents had two sets of twins. It's not very common, as I'm sure you would imagine. I think twins are a lot more common these days, but certainly not two sets of identical twins. So that's a fun fact about me that I like to share because I think it's meant that I've really never had anything to myself, and I've had to share everything in life. Um, but yeah, it's fun. It's fun having three sisters who kind of all look like you, and I think I for a long time just became used to people calling me another name or calling me twin.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's a fun story I like to share.
That is fun. So, Shante, can you give the audience an overview of your current organization, Second Muse, and your role at the organization?
Sure. Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I currently work for a company called Second Muse. We are a global innovation and impact firm focused on building economies of the future that are more regenerative, resilient, and inclusive. And so that looks like launching innovation programming across the globe. We define innovation programming as incubators, accelerators, venture studios, and challenges. Some examples of our work include the Space Apps Challenge, which we've been running for, I believe, around 10 years for NASA. We recently launched and ran the Food Vision Prize through Rockefeller Foundation. We have a couple of various incubators and accelerators throughout the country and the globe. Where we really support entrepreneurs and new technologies in scaling. And one other really exciting example that I know I've already spoke to you about, Raj, is Melinda Gates' Pivotal Ventures Get Cities initiative, which is really focused on supporting women and entering technology, but also being able to thrive in leadership throughout the technology sector. So those are some examples of our work. We have a capital arm that is fairly new in comparison to all the work that we were doing before and are still doing around innovation programming. But our capital arm essentially designs, manages, fundraises, and operates various funding vehicles throughout the globe. An example of that is Circulate Capital's $100 million fund focused on removing plastic from the ocean. So, solutions, technologies, and projects that do that. And we support that effort and cooperate that fund through the incubation network. So yeah, that's an overview of the work. My role is particularly helping to spearhead our climate tech initiatives, starting with New York and sort of the Northeast region. We're doing some restructuring now, and so that'll look like actually tying all of our climate tech work across the globe. We have some not only in New York, but also in Canada and as well as Singapore. So really excited about that. I sit in between our capital team and our Venture for Climate Tech program, which is a climate tech venture studio and accelerator hybrid model that is sourcing and scaling the most promising climate tech innovators across the globe. It's a 6.5 month part-time program for founders and innovators, supporting them going from essentially proof of concept and idea stage to prototype. And we really focus on building strong teams, ensuring that they really understand their business model, their product market fit, what it means to scale. We believe in creating great leaders as well. So we are also incorporating things like social equity into our curriculum. What does it mean to be a great leader? To think about diversity, equity, inclusion, not only internally, but externally as you build your product and scale it. And we offer up to 125K in non-dilutive funding through our funder, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research Development Agency. So that's an overview of the program. And my role specifically is actually spearheading our investor network and partnerships. And so I'm really thinking about the larger climate tech ecosystem, thinking about how we can bring together various stakeholders and ensure that, our founders are, of course, getting supported, but that we are supporting other founders across the globe. We had over 600 unique applications this year for our program, for an inaugural program. As you can imagine, that was a really big number. And so we want to ensure that our 11 companies get supported, but that also all of those companies that didn't make it into our program are able to receive the resources and the support they need to scale, because climate is a big problem, right? And we need everyone. So that's an overview of the work that I'm doing and spearheading, as well as, the work that Second Use does.
I've never heard the term venture studio. Can you share what that is?
Sure. Yeah. Venture Studio, I want to say it's a newer model. It sort of builds off of what a traditional venture capital firm has been. Essentially, the idea is that you actually, a team essentially does a lot of market research into an opportunity, builds out the growth strategy for that company, funds it, and helps launch it. It helps at the very early stage of getting it set up. And that oftentimes looks like bringing on the right leadership. So a C suite, CEO, a CTO, a CFO, whatever it is that is really, or whatever personnel are really needed to scale the venture. And so it starts, the actual venture starts with a certain amount of funding that comes from a fund associated with the venture studio. And then it also oftentimes means that that core team that's doing the market research and helping kick off the company kind of takes a back seat once everything is established, and the leadership they bring on board, which you'll see oftentimes if you look at venture studios, they're typically hiring for an entrepreneur in residence, maybe someone who sold a company or who has had success in the technology space to actually come in house and then take over a company once they formed and funded it. So it's really interesting. I think what it really demonstrates is this shift in venture capital that we're seeing around founders desiring, but also needing not only traditional investor that kind of invests and walks away and maybe supports here or there, but investors that are actually more hands-on, have a bit more, I think, just overall dedication to the company, and want to see returns, stronger returns across the capital that they're dispersing to various companies. So yeah, that's how I would define a venture studio, and I think it's still a newer model, but also a model that is just popping up everywhere these days.
Sounds very interesting. Earlier you mentioned, the climate tech initiative. Are there any technologies you've seen recently come through the program that you've been very interested in?
Yeah, I mean, we have an incredible group of companies. Definitely encourage everyone to check out the companies that we recently announced, which you can do through our innovators page on forclimatetech.org. But yeah, really excited about, again, all of our companies. I think a few that really stand out to me include Clean Ocean Coatings. They're a German company. Since we support global companies, this was actually a really big defining characteristic of our program, was being able to take what has been historically more of a New York solely focused program and make it global. So Clean Ocean Coatings really focuses on the anti-fouling solutions. So toxin-free coating for ships, which at a high level, it makes me think about the importance of what many would describe as low tech solutions. So while of course they're doing a bunch of R&D and research and have been in a lab, ultimately what they're building is a new and better product, right, that has existed in the past. And the coatings that they provide actually allow for 2 years more of durable, or are 2 years more durable, excuse me, than conventional coatings. They're a lot easier to clean and also have a uniquely smooth surface. So that's one example. I think another example of a great company that we have in our portfolio includes Alchemer. Laureen, the founder, is absolutely incredible. And they are essentially, building a solution in the green hydrogen space that allows for the reduction of the cost of water electrolyzers by more than 300%. So, yeah, really excited about that solution, particularly as hydrogen continues to, I think, raise in its profile as an energy source that most people in this space are recognizing, right, really needs to be prioritized, but also has a lot of promising outcomes for climate. So those are a couple. There are a few others just because of my cities background or really thinking about future of cities and my previous roles. Volt Post, which is essentially turning lamp posts into electric vehicle charging stations. So a lot around, right, the built environment and infrastructure. How can we actually use existing infrastructure in cities to make them more sustainable, but also create alternative mobility options for residents.
Sounds like fascinating companies. And yes, I will share the link in the show notes just for my own curiosity too. I think the toxin free one really caught my curiosity because, again, like you mentioned, there are these unsexy industries, if you will.
Yeah.
And there's so much change that's required, or so much opportunity there. In the digital world, you almost think about taking companies from analog to digital, and there's a lot of analog companies still out there. But
Mhm.
the toxin free coating for ships, it definitely piqued my interest.
Yeah, yeah, same here. I mean, so they actually applied to our global challenge that we ran as part of our recruitment process. And, we wouldn't have otherwise probably seen their application because they didn't apply to the actual program, just the challenge. And all of our judges that were involved across multiple industries and sectors were really excited by this solution. I think the ability to actually see and be able to measure in the short term its impact just from application alone is something that really excited not only my team but then all of the amazing and incredible individuals involved in the process.
So it sounds like you have your hands full with your day job. But I'm going to switch gears here and talk about another project you're working on, which is the Women of Color Collective in Sustainability. Can you talk to us about that organization?
Yeah, thanks, Raj. Yeah, I appreciate you highlighting that. And my team jokes that I'll forget to mention this, even though it is near and dear to my heart, and honestly, a passion project that has just really taken off, which is both exciting and shows the need for intentional discussion and action around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the sustainability space. So, Woke Sis, that's what we call it for short, was born out of really, I think, solving my own problem in this space, and that was just recognizing earlier on when I was prior to the work that I do now, was scaling various companies across urban and climate tech, solving big problems for cities and that meant building out go to market strategies and social impact strategies and thinking through things like pilot projects and demos and strategic partnerships. And I just found that I was oftentimes the only woman of color, the only Black woman, and many times as well the youngest person in the room. And I saw the opportunity in that, but I also saw or was able to take a step back and really analyze what that meant for the future of an industry where we're solving big problems, right? And I mentioned this earlier, but we truly do need all hands on deck for in order for us to solve the climate crisis, particularly when we think about who it disproportionately impacts, which includes communities of color, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I started Wokesis alongside one of my close friends and now co-creators, Jordi Vasquez. She was at Bright Power at the time. I was at my previous company, and we were attending an event at Climate Week, New York. For those who aren't familiar with Climate Week, it's a really big week in New York City where global leaders essentially come to convene in person and talk about key areas throughout climate, a lot of industry folks, but then also discussions around policy and impact. So we went to, or I decided to go to an evening event that was an all women's event. And it was an incredible event. And I really appreciated the space made for women, though the reality was that the room still didn't reflect diversity. And so myself and Jordy were actually the only woman of color in the room that evening. And we said hi to each other, started chatting. She became a good confidant of mine, and we started sharing resources. And my old firm would host a lot of private dinners, and I would invite her to all of them, invite her to all of the events we held, and she did the same with me. She had a really neat newsletter called Urban Onsite at the time. And she's really sort of a creative, um, into the arts, into kind of public placemaking and what that means for sustainability in cities. And we met up one day and we're sort of like, hey, this is great that we're doing this for each other. But the reality is that we know there are more women of color out there. We know that there are more women of color that want to be and more involved or maybe even transition into this space. And we couldn't find a community anywhere online that was focused on women of color in particular. And so her and I spoke about it for a little bit, and we were just hanging out one day and we're like, hey, we're going to create this space for other women who look like us, who are seeking community, who are seeking peer mentorship and resource sharing. And so that's really how Wokesis was born. I think it was a Friday. We were in South Street Seaport, and we were like, let's just do this thing. Let's create it. And so I am still blown away, to be honest, with the amount of traction, support, but also enthusiasm from other women of color, even other corporations and organizations to support our mission. And so Wokesis today really is a collective. It's one of the very few, I think at the time we launched it, might have been the only really dedicated to Black, Indigenous, and women of color in the sustainability field, supporting them through creating access to opportunities, jobs, speaking opportunities, and then creating community amongst ourselves, which I think is really important. So the resource sharing, the peer mentorship. Prior to COVID, we had done only a few meetups, and then also we're working on a campaign called "This Is What Sustainability Looks Like," which is kind of our tagline. Our goal there is to essentially shift and normalize that sustainability is diverse, that it is inherently made up of diverse voices and women of color. And so we were doing all those great things, and then COVID hit, and so in-person meetups died down. But really, what happened was that we saw immense growth over COVID, and I think one thing that COVID has made evident is how important community is, especially in difficult times. And so our Google group, our LinkedIn group, which is dedicated to women of color, our monthly newsletter actually grew by 5,000% over the course of 5 months. We held our first summit and planned it all in about 2.5 weeks back in July of 2020. Honestly, Jordy and I thought we'd have maybe tops 40 people attend virtually. We ended up having over 400 global participants, over 40 speakers, all Black, Indigenous, people of color, speaking on various parts of sustainability. And we had over 20 partners and sponsors. So it happened quickly. We were just so grateful for the space. But I think more importantly, it was very evident that what we were creating was needed across this industry and still is. And so we are dedicated to women who are building careers in this space and ensuring that they're amplified, supported, and have the resources they need to thrive. And so that's the story behind Wokesis and why we formed, and what we do. We recently launched a job board for corporations and organizations to list their jobs, or on our site. We require transparency in the pay. So we do, if you decide to post on our website, we do require that you provide a range. And that's because we want to be a part of solving the problem around things like pay inequity in this space. And we felt that it was our duty to make sure that whatever opportunities and jobs and resources we're providing women of color have a level of transparency that we want to see be the standard across the industry. So yeah, that's a little bit or a lot about Wokesis and the story behind it and sort of what we're doing and building.
I want to tease out a phrase you said there. You said this is what sustainability looks like. And I think sustainability climate looks very different on the ground, especially from the people it's affecting, to leadership in
Yeah.
sustainability and climate. How are some of the ways you mentioned mentoring, et cetera, but how do we grow the size of this table, the size of the tent, and get more people of color, women also involved in this movement?
Yeah, I think we started with community, because I think, if you look historically at how any underrepresented community has been able to obtain upward mobility, particularly upward economic mobility, it's really been from strategic planning within that community, and sort of pushing the norms. But I think also when it comes to industry, and I'm certainly still wrapping my head around all of this, and I think Wokesis is as well, in terms of how we plan to continue to push the needle on these matters. But, really a large part of it, in my opinion, is there are certain pieces of knowledge, and kind of industry, I want to say secrets for lack of a better phrase, but that are really imperative to people's ability to move within an organization and a company, but also I think to be seen as a leader in any industry. And so a lot of what we're doing is amplifying the expertise that we have, because what I found as a woman of color is that if I don't create a narrative around my abilities, my expertise, what I bring to, a team, an initiative, or a company, then that leaves space for other people to create that narrative, or for there to be no narrative at all. And I think we see this not only in sustainability. I was mentioning technology to you earlier, since I sit at the center of climate, sustainability, and technology. The reality is that we oftentimes go unseen and unheard, and I think it's really about us being able to maneuver and better understand ways that we can have access within this industry. But ultimately, it does come down, in my opinion, to the organizations and the corporations. And so, again, we're, I think, only one piece of the puzzle, but I will say that Jordy and I have been talking a lot about what it is that we want to continue to pursue through Wokesis. And we are a community for women of color first, because we think that is absolutely critical to just honestly having the support you need to, especially these days, right? In light of COVID-19, we've just gotten so many kind messages from women who are like, I got a new job. I got a new resource, a new leadership opportunity because of your Google group, because of your newsletter. And I think, for us, that's a win, because it shows that through the creation of a community committed to each other, we can open doors for one another. On the flip side, ultimately, I think corporations and companies and organizations have to really commit to what it means to allow people, women of color, to be in an organization and a company and thrive, and actually, rise up the ranks. To your point around leadership, like, we know when we started Wokesis, the numbers were absolutely dismal. They still are, to be frank. But the reality to me is that our job board is the first step in that. We're actually working on the summit, trying to connect women of color to corporations and organizations. And I think making it clear that it needs to be a reciprocal relationship. Like, yes, women of color need jobs. We want leadership opportunities, but we also want to be in spaces and workplaces that are healthy, that are safe, that are really invested in who we are and allow us to show up as the leaders we are. And so I think there is this balance of saying we want more women of color in leadership. I think the question that I think a lot about, and that we pose to corporations and organizations and companies that reach out to us, is, are you creating a culture and an environment where, if we did match you with a great woman of color for an initiative, that they'd feel that they'd have the resources and just overall what they need to actually thrive as a leader. And so, yeah, I'll stop there. I won't pretend to have all the answers, but I do think there's, on one end, such a critical aspect to creating community for women of color to learn from each other and feel like they have a space for them. But two, it does come down to, can companies and how can companies really commit to hiring and elevating women of color, and providing them with the resources, right, that they need in the workplace. So, yeah, that's what comes to mind for me.
So it's not easy, but easier to enroll people that are perhaps knowledgeable about climate or sustainability into, our tribe. But how do you convey the message to those that perhaps don't realize some of the effects of climate, or sustainability on their everyday lives and say, look, these are other opportunities that perhaps you should be exploring or considering?
Yeah, I think it makes me actually think about conversations I've had with my family. So I'm like, the climate person in my family, the sustainability person. I think if you ask my parents what I do, they probably can't tell you, to be honest. But I think the reason why I mention that is because for me, it's been about meeting people where they are, not expecting them to already be at a level that you're at, and that's really important because I think when you look at industry language and conversation, I do think that there's something to be said about, right, like just the language and the words we use. Like language can remove people from a conversation. And I think when it comes to sustainability and climate, like all of us who are professionals in this space, who are doing this work, have a duty to ourselves, to people, and to the planet to make this work accessible because people want to be a part of it. People want to do better, but they may not know how if we show up and immediately start talking about carbon modeling, right? And all of these phrases that feel like common knowledge to us but aren't to the everyday person, especially to those who are oftentimes experiencing it firsthand. And so yeah, I do think that that's one of the biggest ways that we can continue to knock down the barriers to people really feeling a part of the solution, or feeling like they can actually engage in a meaningful way. And then going back to what I just said, meeting them where they are. So I think a good example of this is the public health conversation. One of my first deep dives into environment was actually working with the Department of Health and Middle Hygiene on a public health initiative. And we were essentially doing a deep dive into what KPIs can we use to understand how to create a healthier East Harlem. And a lot of it came down to, food quality and access to food. So the realization that food deserts and lack of kind of, what is it, farm to table options prevent people from being healthier. Recognizing that a large number of bus depots and highways are over concentrated in communities of color, and thus you see higher rates of asthma and other health effects. And so I think ultimately we have to talk about climate and sustainability holistically and all of the other issues that tie into it, because a lot of times maybe someone won't understand fully sustainability or climate, but they will understand that their child has asthma because of the air quality in their neighborhood. They will understand that they don't have access to local food because there aren't adequate supply chains to provide that. And so I think really it's up to us to not sit in our like climate bubbles, right? And talk about all of the science and all of the technologies, which are great, but ultimately these technologies have to be deployed. They have to be adopted, and that adoption, that deployment has to be done by everyday people. And so the way that we build and ultimately deploy these technologies have to be accessible if we're going to have the type of impact we want. And I think there are really some great case studies as of the past year or two where you're seeing that with technology. You're seeing the value of making it accessible, kind of creating bite-sized ways for people to understand from their perspective, like why this solution matters or how they can engage with it.
I love the idea of meeting people where they're at, and so much what you said specifically around the vocabulary and the language that's used. I think it can be very intimidating, and so the idea of perhaps introducing people, as you said, bite-sized moments in their life, or how some of these issues intersect in their lives. You mentioned the bus station example. I think are very important, especially from a time perspective, meaning that people are already extremely overwhelmed with everyday life. And then we have this
Hmm.
additional issue of COVID currently going on, and we have health issues. So finding those bite sized opportunities to introduce them to this subject, I think, is a great way to do it.
Yeah,
So,
100%. And I know that there are people who've been doing this way longer than I have, and I appreciate other women in this space who've really paved the way for me. So I just want to mention that briefly because I think Peggy from We Act and Majora Carter, like they are two women that I look up to and have really been a part of, I think, thinking through what it means to advance big solutions, but do it through a place based and kind of a local perspective. So yeah, ultimately all of these really big visions we have to be broken down into actual ways to, right, deploy them and build them.
Absolutely. You said something earlier, which is leading to my next question. And I really like the way you said it about creating a narrative for ourselves rather than there being no narrative or waiting for someone else to create one for us. Next question is, you've been on this journey, like you said, for a while as an African American woman in tech, and now clean tech. What are some of the most valuable lessons you've learned about yourself on your journey?
That's such a good question. So one thing that comes to mind is just this idea that our journeys are our own. And sometimes I do feel like there's this tension, particularly if you're a person of color, of, paving the way or being the first, which is certainly admirable and I think super important. But I've honestly been, as of late, very weary of being celebrated as the only or the first, because I don't think that that's something that we should be celebrating or normalizing, to be frank. And so I think that's one thing that I would say, one big thing that I've learned in this journey, that, like, particularly as an African American woman, I am not, honestly, I can't think of a better word at the moment, but I'm not impressed or interested in being the only or the first. I think it's not only on me, but all of the people who are acknowledging that I'm the first or I'm the only, to be committed to making sure that that's not what we celebrate. Like in the next 10 years, I don't want to have to celebrate an Asian American woman or a, Caribbean woman being the first. I know that that's how we create movement in society. Someone has to do it first. But it makes me think about, and I was talking to my friend recently, when I realized, like, hey, I really am oftentimes the only or the first, particularly in my various demographic groups. I wanted to change that. And I created Wokesis just for that. I don't want to be the only young African American woman that's invited to speak or to be at the table. I want people to know that there are so many other young women of color that are also doing great work in this space and committed deeply. So I think that's one learning that I think is huge. I do feel like we have a duty to recognize that if we are the only or the first, that we should be pulling other people in. And I am where I'm at now because of the woman I named earlier, and so many other countless women who I probably don't know the names of, but should, right? And so I think, for me, that's really important. And then the other thing I'll say is, I was having a discussion recently around this as well, is that, we I think sometimes we tell young people to kind of follow the paths of others. So I remember being younger and someone saying, go to someone else's profile. Or there was like LinkedIn. I don't remember what we were using at that time. LinkedIn was was not as popular then, but kind of like go read their bio and then kind of try to replicate everything they've done to get where they're at. And I look back at that now, and I honestly think it's some of the worst advice we can give people in their various journeys, because I feel like what we do is we limit people by saying, look at someone else's journey and follow their journey. I think that, ultimately we each have an ability to tap into what is our fullest potential. And, while I think exploring things are healthy, right, and being able to know your options and figure out which one is best for you, ultimately we all have to choose our own paths. And I would really love it if we actually started talking about our journeys, our career paths, as something for us to explore solely as an individual interested in figuring out, what am I great at? What do I love to do? And where's that kind of nice intersection where I can do the great things that I'm good at in a place where I am excited to do them, versus, go follow this other person and see if you might like it once you've, sort of achieved all of the things that they've done. So yeah, I think those are two highlights. I'm sure there's lots more that I've learned, but I think, yeah, ultimately acknowledging that your path is your own and you can certainly learn things from other people, but that you don't have to follow exactly in their footsteps to do great things. And that, our duty, I feel, is to create more access for people, and more opportunities, and not just stop at being the first or the only.
Reminds me of a blog post that I wrote a long time ago titled One Size Fits One.
I love that. Exactly. You just said everything I was trying to say in 3 words. So thank you.
um, so the crux of our conversation is the why behind what you do. You're obviously very driven. There are some obvious reasons, but what drives you? What motivates you? What keeps you going?
Yeah, I think just honestly, I learned at a really young age, and I mentioned how important family was to me. But I tell people I come from a family of public servants. My dad was a firefighter. He also DJ'd on the side, so a little spunky and creative, which was always fun. My mom was in the medical space, and my grandmother was a nurse and a civil rights activist. And to this day, she will still, now in her 80s, kind of march around the community and make sure people are registered to vote. And I grew up hearing stories about how courageous she was at an age younger than what I am now. And I think it just really inspired me to do the things that scare me, to be brave, to be courageous, to push the norm. I think a lot about how we're normalized to stay within right boxes and the lines, and we're told, well, that's just kind of what everyone does. Or it's status quo, the norm, and I've never known that as my default because I didn't grow up in a space or in a home where accepting kind of what the norm was just what people did. It was actually the exact opposite for me. And my grandmother, I think, again, has played a huge role in me seeing that kind of drawing outside the lines, right, is an exciting way and that to live life and also a way that works for me. So I think all of that to say that what really drives me is this idea that if I don't like a norm, or if I think there's a better way to do something, or if I want to see change, that I have everything that I need to be a part of that solution. And then I think the second part to that is just valuing community. I recognize that the work that my grandmother did, she didn't do alone. The work that I do now, I don't do alone. I have an incredible team through Venture for Climate Tech and Second Use. Wokesis, I feel like, is just very evident, right, of this value of community that we can't go it alone in this lifetime. I mean, we can try, but I don't see that working out for most people. And so, yeah, for me, it's really like being a part of something bigger than yourself and not being scared to really dive into the unique value and gifts that you bring to this world, and bringing other people into community to also actualize that on their end.
I love the idea of pushing norms and growing community. Also, sounds like I should be interviewing your grandmother.
Yes, you should. She's incredible.
Um, you mentioned second muse again in Wokesis, but you also mentioned a better way to do something. Can you tell me a little bit about the future economy lab you're working on?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. Yeah, to this point, I think this is exactly what we are trying to do in the capital space at the moment. So I mentioned Second Muse's capital arm. It's been around for a few years now. We have a blended capital model. And essentially, the way that we think about funding mechanisms is let's really create what we are hearing is of need. And if it hasn't existed before, let's create something new. And so the Future Economy Lab essentially brings together corporations, governments, investors, and foundations to explore specific economy. I'm focused on climate tech, as I mentioned, so we'll be diving into the climate space. And we're actually seeking participants at this time. So, having a bunch of conversations with various venture groups, as well as government entities, academic institutions, really anyone or any entity that is either in this space interested in entering more into this space and being a part of exploring, what is an economy, a climate economy, in need of, particularly in the New York and Northeast region, and then how can we create something that solves for whatever that need is. And so whatever at the end of the actual process, we'll be pulling together a report. We've done this before, and then actually creating a or having a recommendation for what that funding mechanism should be. And then we go out and build it. We bring a team on or add to a team if we have an existing team, and then actually fundraise around this. So yeah, I'm currently seeking people who would be interested in learning more, potentially participating. It's a low lift commitment. You show up to a couple of workshops and design sessions. They'll all be virtual in light of COVID. But it's a really, really exciting process. We share all of the data and insights at the end with those who participate. And then we go out and build something great that's going to solve a big problem. So again, I feel like it is reiterating, right, this idea of community and sort of bringing people together to solve big problems. So I'm excited. Would love to talk to anyone who might be interested. We are looking for funders for this work, and we've worked with previous entities like the Gates Foundation and others to help fund this work. So really, really excited, and yeah, I'll be focusing on that over the next few months.
So let's stay on the topic of the future for a moment. And since you're doing so much, I want to focus directly on you. Let's imagine it's 2030, you're looking back almost like a legacy view. Where do you see yourself, or what kinds of progress or effect do you see yourself making in this movement over the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I immediately go to my cohort companies and honestly just projects and ideas that are bringing together the right stakeholders. But, hopefully in 10 years, we will have some great use cases for the companies in our portfolio through Venture for Climate Tech. So really hoping that we support these founders and that they're able to scale great solutions, and that we are seeing a huge impact when it comes to GHG emissions across not only New York State, but other areas as well where they can apply their technology. I think also, larger or on a higher level, I'd really love to be working across cities and exploring what does it look like to share data, insights, and how we build and deploy technologies, and how we think about not only their go-to-market strategy, but embedding again this idea of equity and community and impact into building those solutions. And hoping that as well, Wokesis is this global, it is a global collective, but that it expands to reach hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of women of color across the globe. We've gotten some inquiry from people in Africa and the Caribbean recently. So just really excited about what that can be. But ultimately, I really want to see the best solutions, ideas, projects being funded and deployed. And so I think being a part of making sure that there's the right community funding and resources for all of that, and kind of being at the center of it would really be ideal for me. So, a lot of that I think I'm doing, but being able to do it on a massive scale. So having a capital arm, maybe even a research and sort of data and insights institute, and really embedding equity. So that means women of color, right, BIPOC communities across all of it. And so, yeah, that's what I think about in 10 years. And who knows, that might change, but those are the things that come to mind.
Which sounds like a beautiful vision. Going to my last question here. Again, I think the standout comment from this conversation has been the idea of narrative. But if you could specifically share some words of advice, and it could be personal, it could be professional, words of advice or wisdom with the audience, what would it be?
Yeah, it makes me think of a quote. I know it's a probably widely shared quote, but it was said to me by someone I just truly adore and respect. And what was said to me was, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was something along the lines of, don't let other people's, like sometimes other people's ceilings are your floor, and that's okay. And I think that's for me been really important because sometimes or not even sometimes, a lot of times I feel that as a young African American woman, I've found myself in places and rooms that are doing really big things where I have decision making power and I'm able to move the needle on such important conversations and topics, and recognizing that I'm both grateful and excited, and that me wanting to dream bigger or do bigger things are okay as well. So that, there's a duality of being able to say I'm grateful for what I have now and the opportunities that have been presented for me, and I have this desire to have an even bigger impact, or do bigger things because I see bigger solutions and opportunities. And that's been really important to me because one quote that I believe it was my grandmother, if I'm not mistaken, introduced to me at an early age. It was just, don't dim your light for other people. Don't make yourself small for other people. That if you ever start feeling small where you're at, that it just means that it's time for you to find a place that's bigger for you. But not feeling like you have to be smaller for the sake of making others comfortable. And so that would be, yeah, that would be advice I'd give people. I've ended up in amazing places and opportunities, and I think staying humble is really important, but also recognizing your gifts and leaning into them, and wanting more when you feel like you've maybe outgrown your current situation is fine. It's okay. And I think it means that we're doing something right. So yeah.
I love the idea of not to dim your light for other people. I think it's a great place to end. I'm so excited about the work you're doing, and I'm also excited to explore opportunities to collaborate with you in the future.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much, Raj. I really appreciated all of your questions. Yeah, and just how incredibly committed you are to all of the work that you're doing. I know you're also juggling a lot. So just really happy that I was able to be a guest on this episode, and I'm looking forward to finding meaningful ways to collaborate in the future as well.
Thank you, Chante, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Same here. Thanks, Raj.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please give us a rating and review on iTunes. And you can show your support by sharing our show with a friend or reach out to us on social media, where you'll find us under our Nexus PMG handle. If there's a subject or topic you'd like to hear about, send me an email, btu@nexuspmg.com, or contact me via our website, nexuspmg.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter, where we share what we're reading and thinking about in the clean tech, green tech sectors. Bigger Than Us is a Nexus PMG production.